So welcome to this week's Optimum Health Clinic Facebook Live. And my apologies, it ended up starting a bit later than planned. It's just been one of those days in terms of timings. So I was sitting here thinking about what to cover in this week's Facebook Live, and I have also been doing the preparatory work for next year's practitioner program, which we'll start promoting in the next, I imagine, kind of 10 days or so. And it got me thinking on a kind of thought path, which I thought would be helpful for those of you that are aware of wanting to do some psychology work, or indeed perhaps are working doing some psychology work with someone at the Optimum Health Clinic or somewhere else, and trying to make sense of how different psychological approaches will fit together, and specifically in the context of recovery from ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia. And so, to give a bit more kind of context on that, there are people which are doing more counselling or psychotherapeutic approaches, people which are doing CBT and more cognitive approaches or behavioural kind of combined approaches, people that are doing more mindfulness-based work, people that are doing more coaching-based work. And I think it can often feel quite overwhelming to have a sense of what do we need to be doing, like what's going to be most important or most supportive of our recovery process. And indeed, how do those different approaches fit together? So early on in my recovery process, if you'd said to me that psychology was part of the picture, it's one of the few things that would have given me a rush of energy and a desire to rearrange your facial structure in some way. Because it was very clear in my experience that obviously what was happening was very physical in nature. And I'm not going to go into a whole kind of background around mind and body. I know we've covered that in other places. But my understanding of psychology at that point was more traditional counseling psychotherapeutic approaches. And to me, the idea of talking about my past and my history and what had happened seemed utterly irrelevant to the picture of my illness and my desire of a path to recovery. And then over time, I started to get into meditation and mindfulness, and I couldn't make sense of where did those things relate to psychotherapy. And then in time, I started to get into things like NLP and life coaching, and I started to really love that work. But again, couldn't really reconcile where that met things like psychotherapy and counselling and that kind of thing. And it took me many years of my own personal journey, and then becoming a practitioner, then training other practitioners in this way of working, to, in a sense, put a framework that sits around this, which on one hand is remarkably simple. I mean, when I explain it, I think you're going to think, well, like, duh, that's obvious. But it wasn't obvious to me, and I think it's actually not so obvious until it becomes obvious because you put a certain framework around it. And that's that there are therapeutic approaches that will help deal with things in the past. There are approaches that will help us deal with living more in the now, like being more present in this moment. And there are approaches that are more focused towards the future. And so traditional psychotherapy and counseling approaches tend to have a primary orientation towards the past, to understand why we felt certain things that happened to us, how they shaped us, how they made us feel. And the assumption is that to work with our life now and in the future, the answers lie in dealing with the past. We then have things like mindfulness and meditation and certain more, I guess, kind of spiritual approaches. And their focus will be towards the present, on being here, being present in the now, in this moment. And that the past isn't so important, the future's not so important. What matters is being present and being here. And then we have approaches like coaching and some of the NLP pieces, though they can also look at the past and present as well. But certainly more kind of life coaching approaches, which are focused towards the future. It's like, if you can create the future that you want, then your life will be better and happier. So figuring out where are you now, where do you want to get to, and what's the path that's going to support you in getting there. And what became very clear to me over the years was different people need different things at different times in different ways. And any truly effective practitioner working from a psychology perspective, there's many different tools and methodologies and ways of working, but fundamentally needs to have tools for working with the history in the past, the things that have happened that have shaped us, that have made us who we are, need to have ways to shape and cultivate the future that we want to move towards and to create, but also need to help us to be able to be present and grounded and here in the now and in this moment. And I think the thing which is particularly important here is certain therapeutic tools will be overly emphasizing the importance of one of these pieces. So, for example, someone just working with psychotherapy will be very focused on the idea that you need to deal with what's happened in the past. And if you deal with the past, the present and the future will be handled. Or you will work with a life coach, and they will be, you just need to create a compelling future that you move towards, and if you do that, then everything else will be okay. Or you go to see someone and you do work around mindfulness, and it's like, if you can just be present, don't worry about the past, the future will take care of itself, just learn to be here. And that's the danger, is when someone is overly focused on one of those three orientations. Sometimes what we need, if we're overly caught in the past, is to bring our attention to now and the future. If we're overly future orientated, to come to the now and address the past. And sometimes the thing that most stops us being in the now is things that are unresolved from the past, or what stops us being in the now is that the future's so uncertain that it's causing a great deal of stress and anxiety. And so, in a sense, what we need on the recovery path is some combination of these three pieces, but for different people at different stages of recovery, that combination is going to be different. And so for one person, it might be primarily an orientation to being more mindful and more present, dealing with certain key pieces that have happened in the past, and having a healthy relationship to setting appropriate goals to progress into the future, whilst listening to one's body and being in balance in the process. For somebody else, it may be that until they deal with certain trauma in the past, be that using psychotherapy or Paula mentioned EMDR, which can be a great tool, or be it something like EFT, but until they deal with what's happened in the past, that trauma is what's stopping them being present and here in the moment. So, and there's lots of other different variations of these pieces. So one of the things that we're doing as practitioners is we're trying to map what's needed in this instance. Do we need to deal with past, present, future? Probably a certain amount of all three. What do we need to prioritize? Often our kind of default, and it's often the starting point for many people, is calming down enough of the stress and anxiety that's happening now to then, from that point, to deal with past and future as appropriate. So, yeah, I think that's much of what I wanted to say, and in the spirit of wanting to keep these Facebook Lives relatively short and succinct, the question really for you is, when you look at, kind of from a psychology perspective, what's important or appropriate to support your recovery, is that learning to be more present now? Is that dealing with the impact of things in the past? Is that your relationship to progressing into the future? It's probably all three, but what's the balance? And if you're overly emphasized towards one of those, maybe that's appropriate, or maybe you're overly emphasized towards what's comfortable. So if you find it easier to deal with the past than the present or the future, maybe you need to look more at the present and the future, and again, different iterations of what that might be in that example. So I hope that's been useful. I hope that's not been too abstract or theoretical. Do share comments, questions, thoughts underneath, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. And please do also let me know topics or areas that you'd like me to cover or explore in future Facebook Lives as well. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.